Anishinaabe-Algonquin territory. The peoples of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. This gathering is to hear from panelists from across the lands that our Indigenous colleagues, including two who are on our panel today, refer to as Turtle Island. As we hold this event today, we honor the original people of this land and territory and their wisdom, which has been disregarded and forcibly hidden for too long. I'm Jodine Chase, and I'm here with my colleague Michelle Pensabranco, who will shortly introduce our panel. We're the co-founders of Safelyfed Canada, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to improving Canadian preparedness for the needs of infants and young children during emergencies. So I'm going to fill in today with introductory remarks for Lisa Wolfe from UNICEF Canada, who is unfortunately unable to attend. UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Fund and works in Canada and around the world to advance the universal human rights of children and youth. Children need appropriate foods at the right time to grow and develop to their full potential. Children have the right to the best nutrition, which includes breastfeeding. Breastfeeding initiated within the first hour of birth, provided exclusively for 6 months and continued up to 2 years and beyond, is an important part of the first stage of a child's journey through life. So we're here this evening because as mothers, infants, and their families walk along that path, it is our responsibility to help clear that path for breastfeeding. Lisa asked me to talk to us about this path and some of the milestones we've achieved due to the strenuous efforts of many of those who are represented here, and some of the milestones that we still need to run towards. Many mothers and babies in Canada start along this path. Almost 90% of us initiate breastfeeding, and then Canada falters. By 6 months, only 1 in 3 mothers are exclusively breastfeeding, and the rate tends to be lower amongst those families who face structural inequities and the ongoing impacts of colonization. In contrast, the global average is around 40%, and twice as many babies are breastfed at 6 months in Norway as in Canada. In fact, the drop-off rate in breastfeeding in Canada after initiation is more substantial here than in almost any other high-income country. What this suggests is that many women decide to start but do not have the support they need to continue on the path that they chose, the path to breastfeed. Canada adopted the Global World Health Assembly target to increase the rate of exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months by at least 50% by 2025, and we have pledged to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals target of 70%. We have a long distance to cover in a short period of time. There have been many milestones that have helped us along this path. The 10 Steps to Successful Breastfeeding were launched in 1989, and in 1991 we introduced the Baby Friendly Initiative. A global community of more than 20,000 birthing facilities now follows those 10 steps in the majority of countries, and that includes Canada. In 2003, the World Health Organization and UNICEF jointly developed the Global Strategy for Infant and Young Child Feeding to revitalize efforts to enable mothers and other caregivers to make and take informed choices about optimal feeding practices. This strategy specifies not only the responsibilities of governments, but other organizations, international and national, and other concerned parties in a joint framework for accelerated action. And in recent years, federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments, hospitals and birthing facilities, communities, researchers, and organizations like ours have worked to improve maternity protection in Canada. Now, Health Canada has initiated the modernization of the food and drug regulations which govern foods for infants in Canada, and this is an important opportunity to apply evidence and a rights-based perspective to infant and young child feeding and nutrition, and to implement the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. So Lisa concludes, UNICEF looks forward to Canada stepping fully into its role as envisioned in the global strategy, which Canada has championed numerous times at World Health Assemblies, and looks forward to seeing Canada articulate a national policy a national infant and young child feeding policy. So she concludes, while the regulatory policy environment is critical to protect and support breastfeeding, and the health sector shapes the conditions in which breastfeeding can thrive, the artistic world is also playing a role. The film we just saw, Milk, provides an important perspective on the need for regulations and policies, for baby-friendly hospitals, and for other efforts to protect new mothers and infants and families from what it calls the politics, commercialization, and controversies surrounding them, at what should be a time of respect, peace, and safety. Milk celebrates bringing a new life into this world, and it is a Canadian gift to Canada and to the world, with more than 500 screenings in 178 countries and counting. Milk is presented this evening in partnership with Safelyfed Canada and its partners, and has been proudly supported by UNICEF worldwide. And we are grateful to UNICEF for their unflagging support, and to Lisa for preparing these remarks. So now I would like to thank the Honourable Peter Fonseca, Member of Parliament for Mississauga-Cooksville, the Honourable Laila Goodridge, Member of Parliament for my hometown, Fort McMurray, and Cold Lake, where I was born. The Honourable Laurel Collins, Member of Parliament for Victoria, for co-sponsoring our event. MP Collins isn't able to be here, and we thank the Honourable Carol Hughes, Member of Parliament from Algona, Manitoulin, I'm so sorry.
Kapuskasing.
Kapuskasing, thank you. Oh, those Albertans are terrible. These other names. I would like to acknowledge also the Ambassador of Argentina, Josefina Martinez Gramubia. Welcome all. And I will now turn things over to Michelle, and she will introduce our panel. And we should perhaps ask our panelists to move forward to the front. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Please have a seat. And before you sit down, let me introduce you from the front. So thank you, everyone. We are going to have a panel for a period of time, and we'll have an opportunity to have some questions from the floor before we move into the reception. And I need to begin by inviting Noemi Weis, who is the filmmaker for this amazing film. Her storytelling and her passion and her honesty for telling the stories of the parents that she met with through this film, and then for bringing her film to the world. And her films have been catalysts for social change all over the planet, and it is really an honor for us to bring Milk back today to Ottawa. With the help of the TELUS Fund and Film Law support, we've been able to bring this program all across the country, and we're very excited to be wrapping it up here in Ottawa. So I'd like to give Noemi an opportunity to introduce herself and to tell you a little bit about why she's here today and why she's bringing the film back to Ottawa.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Honourable Peter Fonseca, for taking the initiative to support us, and Laila Goodridge for coming along and supporting us, and Laurel Collins, who unfortunately is not here. I'm sorry, I forget. I'm very bad with names, but as you can see, I have a visual memory. And everyone here for taking the time to be with us. Just as a very brief trajectory of Milk, you know, when I start, and the great honor of me to have the support of the Ambassador of Argentina. As you could see, I have an accent, and that's where my accent is from. It's from Argentina. My adult life is Canadian, but I was invited, just as an anecdote, just 10 days ago it was Flag Day here in Canada, and the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration invited me to be the speaker at their event and to talk about why I always say that I carry both flags in my heart. So having you here really makes a big difference, especially under the surroundings that we are in at the Parliament, on Parliament Hill, and surrounded by the people that are supporting us. So thank you so much. It means a lot to me. So very briefly about milk, starting a film of this nature requires a lot of research, and I spent a few years talking to moms from around the world, and experts as well. And the film had a trajectory that was unusual in comparison to other of my films who have really just done the round and of film festivals, which is the normal course. With Milk, I felt that we needed to go to the grassroots and we needed to make a difference. We needed to touch the people where it really needed to be told those stories to be able to achieve that support. And I'm proud to say that, yes, we covered the world in very many ways, but we also brought implementation of changes that were brought into communities globally. There is no language, no socioeconomic background, no culture that really differs from bringing mothers support and supporting that mother, because that mother wants the best for their child. So that was my intention in going to 11 countries and 35 cities to bring Milk and unite the voices of young mothers, or old mothers in general, and grandmothers, and everybody who really needed to be together as a global unity. And I was fortunate enough to be able to be invited to meet Pope Francis as a result of the changes that were happening globally with the Vatican, with the screening at the Vatican. We were at the United Nations to change legislation. We were at the Senate in Paraguay, and in very many others. And today we are here. We are here because being here in Ottawa, which makes us feel very important, right? Just the fact that we are in Ottawa. And in the surroundings of the Parliament, with people that have the power to make a difference, is bringing the voices of those mothers and the needs for change. We brought Milk back with the intentions of reaching and prepare in emergency situations. Unfortunately, the world is under an emergency. There's nothing that we can do if we don't do something about it. So people say, what can I do? Well, this is what we are doing. So this is a call for everybody. This is what we are doing. The world is in an emergency, and Milk is the very first medium that brings up the topic of what happens under emergency situations. Canada has not been an exception. Canada has suffered wildfires this summer, a lot of evacuations over the years, and Safelyfed Canada started really their foundation, their organization in Fort McMurray, so we are proud to have the representation here for Fort McMurray as well. Thank you. So we have been across Canada. Today we had a presentation which was a culmination in Turkey. I brought the Milk to do the Milk program, educational program, to Turkey because of the earthquake that they have been having. The program was so successful that we increased with another 6 other presentations. Today we had 140 people on screen talking about this problem. We start next week in Guatemala with UNICEF and a whole bunch of other wonderful organizations who are joining us, the Canadian Embassy, one of them. So so the government is always supporting that, and we are pleased to do that. UNICEF and WABA and La Leche League and so many others. So being here today, it's my honor, it's my pleasure. Sorry if I got extended, but I'm going to leave the experts to talk about. My story was told on screen, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you join us, and I'll be here to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we always know it's a risk when we hand you the mic. We would like to invite the MPs who are in the room to share a greeting, I understand. And we have MP Carol Hughes, MP Peter Fonseca, MP Laila Goodridge, and MP Laila Goodridge.
I will be very short, yeah, thank you. And so Michelle Branco is one of my constituents, and she reached out to me, and of course Jodine Chase, and told me all about Safelyfed. I didn't know much about Safelyfed. I'm not a mom, as you can imagine, although I'll tell you, I'm delighted to be here. We have all party support and representation here, and you'll hear from members from the other party. But I was just thinking about my wife when we had our twins. We had twin boys. They were premature. At the time, she couldn't breastfeed right away because they were in isolettes. They were premature 7 weeks, so she had to pump breast milk out, and then after a couple of weeks, when they were able to come home, we did get them on to breastfeeding, and it was not easy. I'll tell you, it was not easy because we did have to have some support from local public health nurses and others to be able to come over and explain how to do it and make sure that it all worked. But the importance of it, and we understood just how important just for just nutritional value for growth, etc. So it was a big part of our family, and that we wanted to do that. So I thank Safelyfed and Naomi and the movie and Milk, and for your awareness, your advocacy, and it's really our honor and privilege to be able to have you here on Parliament Hill. We would have been in Center Block, but as you know, it's under construction, and West Block we don't have as much space, so we're here still on the hill in Valor Building, and we're delighted to be here and hear the panelists. It'll be great to listen to what you have to say and to be here with all of you. So thank you very much. It's a real honor to have you here.
Hello everybody, I'm Laila Goodridge. I'm the Member of Parliament for Fort McMurray Cold Lake. Very warm welcome to Kathy from my home community and a good friend of mine, so it's kind of lovely. I have the honor of being the very first woman that had a baby in the middle of an election campaign and won. I was recruited to be the candidate at 38 weeks pregnant. So it was pretty evident that I was going to have a baby in the middle of an election campaign. So my door knocking looked a little different than many because I had to be on 3-hour shifts to get back to breastfeed because I breastfed my son for the entire till he was 1 year old. My husband was a saint of a man. He actually took a leave of absence, coming back and forth to Ottawa every single week from Fort McMurray with our infant and myself in tow. So lots of unique struggles, lots of unique spaces. I also, about a year ago, made the headlines of news across country, being the person that was saying the thing that so many moms were talking about at the time when there were shortages of formula on the shelves and the government was doing nothing to do it. Because I was talking to the moms that needed formula just so they could feed their children, and they couldn't find it at the shelves, and they were panicked and struggling, and they saw no action. And so I brought forward those voices. And that, I remember sitting there at the time being like, am I really the right person to be bringing this up? I've never bought formula. My son at this point wasn't a year old. He had never had formula. I was like, am I really the person to be doing this? And then I realized I had to be the person because I talked to the moms. I am a mom. And so we brought that forward, and with my second son, I now have a 10-month-old at home. So my days look a little different because he stays back in the riding, and every single morning my day starts a half hour earlier than I would normally start because I pump. And then I go home typically-ish 6 o'clock to pump. And then before I go to bed, another half hour of pumping. And that means an extra hour and a half of every single day is spent just doing that so that I can feed my child, because that's what I think is important and that's what fits with my morals, values, beliefs. He was also a NICU baby, which meant I had to pump for the entire first week he was born and fight to make sure that my child could have breast milk, and fight to do what I knew was safe and good. And so I just sincerely want to thank you. I had an opportunity to watch your film when it was up in Fort McMurray and have a wonderful conversation. I will leave it to the panelists because we have some really exciting pieces, but thank you so much. Thank you.
Bonjour, donc je suis Andréane Lavoie, je suis députée au Québec. I will try to do my best to speak to you in English, mais vous comprendrez que je parle d'abord français. And I'm here in support of the cause, and I'm here, I imagine the movie is really interesting, the documentary really interesting. So congratulations, it's so important subject. I felt pregnant during my last campaign. Finally, I finished my campaign pregnant, and I have my little daughter 2 years before, so she's having now 2 years old. Yes, and for the first year, yes. Also, I'm looking for the word. I'm breastfeed. Sorry. So I did it for the first year. After 6 months, I had the pressure to pump, because for the first 6 months she's with me, and I go in the house, I'm coming, and after this I'm going out to the family room, and after this I go back to the hotel. Okay, during the pause I can do this for the first month, but after this it can be possible. So I have to pump. But for the first year, my little daughter received my whole milk, and for me it's so important. But a lot of pressure that we receive as women to do this for sure. And I know Quebec, and I see so many discussions, and I assist to so many discussions, so many panels, to make me realize how for some women it's a big pressure. And when you can't do this for many reasons, how the woman really it's a shock. But I have the chance. It's worked for me, but I know all the women don't have this chance for sure. But the question is, anyway, the health of, and also my little daughter born 3 weeks before she's supposed to. So we have the pressure. Okay, now she born before, so because we don't know what will be the situation in a few weeks, in a few months. So finally everything's okay. She run everywhere. She's like to job and everything. But for a woman in politics, for sure, it's a big pressure. And if we want more women in politics, we have to open this discussion also.
Yeah.
So definitely, and I recognize some face here tonight, because for me this cause is so important. We need to have more parliament representative, and it's a sensitive issue. But thank you, because we have to talk about it. And it's the question of the health of the children also.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Moi aussi, j'ai vraiment apprécié le film. It's really a wonderful film and really drives home the message. So thank you very much for doing it, and thank you very much for all of your advocacy here. I bring greetings on behalf of Laurel Collins. She had hoped to be here, but her baby was sick last night and still had a fever, low-grade fever today, so she couldn't make it to Parliament. So she's asked me to read something on her behalf, if you just bear with me. So she wants to thank everyone for involved in making this film, and all of the organizations here in Canada working to support breastfeeding. It's amazing how far we've come globally when it comes to supporting parents to breastfeed, but we still have a ways to go. It also had her reflecting on her own breastfeeding journey. So she goes on to talk about the fact that it's so essential that we support parents in whatever type of feeding that works best for them and their babies. Breastfeeding has incredible benefits, but isn't always an option. Initially, she talks about her first child. Initially, her first child was being breastfed. However, because of the work schedule and an election, the baby was actually not just breastfed, but bottle fed with breast milk. But it went to it came to a time where the baby would only take the bottle, and that really broke her heart. And when she was in a position to start breastfeeding again, the baby was having a hard time. So she went on a bit of a campaign to get her child breastfed again, and then the child refused to take the bottle. So the flexibility there for her was very difficult because of where she needed to go. I know she, and a lot of my colleagues will attest to that she usually comes around with a suitcase with her pump. And she's bringing that all over. So at first I thought, oh, she's always leaving, but it was her breast pump. So anyhow, and then now she's had a second child, and who has never taken a bottle. So she indicates that it's often been frustrating, but even more often it's a wonderful and connecting. And only for the simple fact that sometimes she's. I think that any of us who has breastfed, and I know myself included, sometimes you want to do something, but you just can't because you got to feed this baby, right? So she goes on to say that she's very grateful that she's been physically able to breastfeed, and that she has an incredible support from her partner, her family, her staff team, her colleagues, and the community throughout. And then she adds, whether parents breastfeed, chest feed, bottle feed, or tube feed, they need support and encouragement. The early months are immensely challenging and profoundly beautiful. We need to involve governments, communities, and individuals. Let's come together to support all parents and babies on their feeding journey. And I will end by saying that I have breastfed both of my kids. And I've also seen where my girlfriend, who had a child who was in the hospital for a long time, had a heart condition, eventually passed, unfortunately, but she did everything in her power to make sure that that child was going to receive the breastfeeding milk. And it was thanks to the support that she got. I know it was a struggle for a while, but it's thanks to the support that she had that she was able to do this. And after seeing your film here today, I didn't realize the impact that this had on the Philippine people. And I think that we do need to do more that we can. I remember having to go to the bathroom as well to feed my child, and I said never again. They either accept me for who I am and what I'm doing, and my daughter just had a baby in December, and she's breastfed all of her children, so I just want to say, you know, more power to us women, and we are going to be there to help motivate this discussion. Thank you.
So I think what we'll do to start with is we'll invite the panelists to just give us a very brief introduction of themselves, and I'll start, Jessica, I'll start at your end of the table. Just like 30 seconds, a minute, just tell us who you are, why you're here.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Jessica Zimmer and I'm coming to you from Toronto. I coordinate an infant feeding project at a community health center, and I'm also a lactation counselor and a child abuse care practitioner. The program supports 3 public health agency of Canada funded programs. And so all of those folks get access to lactation consultant support in their home. They get newborn care packages, all the feeding accessories they need to feed their babies, group programming, and then just kind of like wraparound holistic support from the programs in conjunction with me. So we just want to remove the barriers to breastfeeding and infant feeding, and we want to empower moms.
Hi, my name is Heather Heinrichs. I am a Métis registered midwife and a lactation consultant. I'm originally from Winnipeg, and my family lines on my mother's side are Poitras and Lloyd, and on my father's side, the Mennonite family is Heinrichs and Hubert. I now live and work in the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife, Samba Cay, on Chief Dry Geese Territory and the homeland of the North Slave Métis. I am the president of the Midwives Association of the Northwest Territories, and I'm also on the core leadership circle of the National Council of Indigenous Midwives and on the board of the Canadian Association of Midwives. I have, in the Northwest Territories, there's not a lot of people to go and do the representation, so we wear many hats. But I also had the honor of representing the National Council of Indigenous Midwives at the International Congress of Midwives this year as well. So I've had sort of a really high level view and been doing a lot of advocacy for midwifery, which also includes and supports breast and chest feeding. So I'm just really happy to be here. We also, sorry, I should mention as well, the evacuations from the Northwest Territories this past summer hit our communities really, really hard. And so we had the pleasure of hosting this film in Yellowknife in November after the evacuations. And we had a really small but sort of diverse background crowd that had just such good conversation about how do we do better on these things. And I'm just really excited to be here and talk about all of those different perspectives that I can bring. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Leslie Frank. I am a professor of sociology from Acadian University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, where I'm grateful to be Canada Research Chair in Food, Health and Social Justice. I have a long history with this topic, so it's really great to be invited. I began as coordinator with the Canada Prenatal Nutrition Program in rural Nova Scotia in the 90s when they first rolled out across the country. And it was there that I really became struck with questions around infant and maternal food insecurity and how family poverty and food insecurity finds its way into the daily lives of families that make infant feeding difficult across all the ways that they might be feeding their babies. So that's where I'm also on the steering committee of Campaign 2000, and I've been dedicated to research, monitoring family and child poverty for about 25 years now, writing the Nova Scotia Child Poverty Report Card. And over the last 15 years, I would say, developing a body of research on maternal and infant food insecurities in rich nations. So I can talk more about that later.
Okay, hi, I'm Kathy Steeves, everybody. I'm with United Way, Fort McMurray, and Wood Buffalo. Laila Goodridge is riding. Woohoo, Laila! And it's funny, hey, because after you hear everybody introduce themselves, I forgot who I am. Wow, you guys are really cool. I'm just United Way, okay, everybody? But I also, in my previous life, worked for emergency social services in the emergency management department at the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. And of course, you all heard that we had a little fire a few years ago that caused our entire population to evacuate south. And since then, we've had fire, flood, pandemic. We received evacuees from up north and from one of our northern communities as well. And together with Jodine and Michelle, we worked really hard after the fact to gather all those lessons learned about how we can help the most vulnerable evacuees and keep them safe and happy. So that's what I do. Thank you so much.
Hello everybody, I am Stephanie George. I'm on OTTAWA, so I'm Oneida from the Six Nations Reserve Turtle Clan. I am an indigenous midwife and an international board certified lactation consultant. I can't pick a career with this short term. I also am an instructor at McMaster University and Faculty of Health Sciences. I teach cultural humility over at York. I'm the past president of the International Lactation Consultant Association. When I started as a student 21 years ago in the Six Nations Birthing Center, I think then we had 3 Indigenous lactation consultants. That was it in Canada. So I pushed to get me certified. I'm grateful it was me. I got hired right out of school. And I just had the wonderful information from Heather. We are now up to 11 Indigenous lactation consultants in Canada. So still a lot of work to do because we have hundreds of reserves. I get into trouble with Jodine and Michelle all the time, and I'm grateful they keep me busy doing these.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Raphaël Petit-Jean. Je ne me risquerai pas à parler en anglais parce que vous ne comprendriez pas grand-chose. Je suis directrice générale du mouvement Allaitement du Québec. C'est un organisme communautaire qui va fêter ses 15 ans dans moins d'1 mois. Notre mission, c'est vraiment de travailler à rendre les environnements favorables à l'allaitement. C'est-à-dire qu'on voudrait que toutes les femmes qui ont décidé d'allaiter puissent allaiter aussi longtemps qu'elles le veulent. Et les statistiques le démontrent que c'est très loin d'être le cas. Et le Québec est en retard sur le reste du Canada en plus. On travaille sur plein de dossiers à la fois parce que ça touche tous les milieux de vie finalement où les femmes sont susceptibles d'allaiter sont présentes, c'est-à-dire à peu près l'ensemble de notre société. Et un des dossiers prioritaires sur lesquels on travaille, c'est la protection de l'alimentation infantile. C'est pour ça que je suis très très fière d'être là aujourd'hui avec vous. Et il y a vraiment beaucoup de choses qu'on peut faire dans ce domaine-là. La première chose que j'ai envie de dire, c'est que en allaitement, on ne peut pas être neutre. L'alimentation infantile, on ne peut pas juste dire « Ah, moi je m'en mêle pas, je laisse les femmes faire ce qu'elles veulent ». C'est vrai que c'est une décision personnelle. On ne peut pas juger les femmes, quelles que soient les décisions qu'elles prennent. Mais c'est une responsabilité de société. Si on n'agit pas au niveau d'allaitement, ça veut dire qu'on laisse toute la place à l'industrie, qui a des intérêts commerciaux énormes, le film le démontre ici. Et en omettant d'agir pour mettre en œuvre le code de l'OMS, le Canada se range du côté des intérêts de l'industrie, plutôt que celui de sa population, et il faut que ça cesse, et il y a des moyens de cesser. Le Canada est vraiment en retard sur l'ensemble des pays du monde par rapport à la mise en œuvre du code de l'OMS, et j'espère que bientôt on va pouvoir reprendre la place qui est celle du Canada, qui est un leader en santé et en droit des femmes, parce qu'il y a vraiment beaucoup d'aspects au niveau de la condition féminine aussi, au niveau de l'allaitement.
So, I will not attempt to make a full translation of Rafael's remarks. I will give you an opportunity to hear what she has to say because I think it's very salient to the rest of the discussion. The Mouvement Éléphant du Québec is an organization in Quebec that focuses on the creation of enabling environments for breastfeeding holistically across many different files. And one of the key files that they work on is the protection of breastfeeding. And in that area, Canada is well behind, despite the fact that that women in Quebec and across Canada intend to breastfeed and wish to breastfeed. And so her call to us is to address Canada's reliance on, or focus on the rights of industry as opposed to the rights of our citizens, our women and children, and the health of that population. I should have started taking notes earlier in the comments. Thank you.
Just, I really want to quickly, there's lights flashing.
Oh, yeah.
That's a vote.
That just means the vote is 30 minutes away, so it's not a fire alarm. There's
No. I've just been assuming that everyone in the room knows that that's okay and they're not running, so I won't either.
I only just started.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Right, I'll try to be quick so that we can get some more questions. I'm Laurie Wells. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Medicine at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, and I'm also the Assistant Dean of Clinical Research. My training is in clinical epidemiology, which has led me to this field, really. I'm also a member of the Baby Friendly Newfoundland and Labrador, which is an organization funded through government, a small amount, I will say, to help protect, promote, and support breastfeeding, and also to help work towards implementing the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative in our facilities. I've been doing research in this area for 20 years. I started when I moved back from England with 3 children in tow, who I sort of successfully breastfed on some level at some point, some more than others. And I think hearing the stories today from the MPs just really illustrates again and again just how unique each woman's journey is. There's not one that's the same. And we can't pretend there are grades because they're all different. I struggled with my first child, who I mixed fed. I successfully fed my son, and my third child, who I was actually doing my master's at the time, decided that because I was gone all day, that was her night, and when I came home, it was daytime. And for 6 months, I fed all night, every night, and still went to the university every day, a 2-hour commute. So I think we all understand the challenges that we go through, and I just applaud people for sharing those stories as well as you all did. The breastfeeding research I've done really started with the first study we published in the early 2000s, which was all around breastfeeding childhood obesity. Obesity is one of my main areas of research, and that's really where my kind of interest first started, actually, around preventing childhood obesity, and that led me to the breastfeeding research, which, as many of us in the room will know, or maybe some won't, that breastfeeding is protective for childhood obesity at preschool. And in Canada, as in many provinces in this country, we have a big problem with childhood obesity, which predicts adulthood obesity, which predicts chronic illness, and we're seeing it earlier and earlier in children, prediabetes, fatty liver disease, hypertension, etc. So we already have something that we can actually focus and support that can prevent those things from happening if we only would. That has led to the latest study that's actually just being published as we speak, which is really around code violations in terms of the international code, the aggressive marketing by industry that really hits all women, and I think Naomi's film really shows everything that's happening, and we see it in other countries, but it's happening right here in our own country as well. And in terms of actually a 58, I think maybe now $60 billion industry, we're up against a lot of effort on their part, and it's going to take a lot of, I think, collaboration, a joint effort on many levels, whether it's federal, provincial, territorial, to actually combat what's really happening. And with the expanse of AI, digital marketing, it's really going to become an enormous issue. And we've seen that in the study which was published. So I will end there, and we'll answer questions, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you. So I will begin. I have a question for Kathy, because you sat in the middle, so that's why you get the first question. I can tell you that. So
It's not a math question, for heaven's sakes.
You're unique, I think, in the world of emergency management in Canada, and certainly in most of the most high income countries, in that you know what it's like to roll out a complete infant feeding and emergencies program. Can you tell us a little bit about, now that you've moved into more of a community-based perspective, what do you feel like was the most key part of that baby child unit work that we did, and how you think that can continue to translate into like community programs like the ones that the United Way supports?
Yeah, great question. I think that the most important thing that we learned was that if we protect the infant or the baby, we actually protect the whole family. And we reduce their exposure to trauma. And there have been some studies done following the wildfire about this, and it shows that the babies and mothers that had the right kind of support easily transitioned back to normal. Those that didn't really struggled. And I remember a story in particular where I think someone, it was either you or Michelle or Jodine, that got a phone call question about, from an evacuated family, asking if toilet water or puddle water was safer to use in bottles. Do you remember that question? And that really hit home for me, because we found that the evacuees that show up on our doors at emergency evacuation centers are not the families that have a ton of support in the first place. Those that can evacuate go to other places. They go to friends, they go to family, they go on vacation. The families that showed up on our doorstep were the ones that were new to Canada and had very little resources. We had families that came to us that were already well into the poverty cycle, showing up on our doorstep. And for the most part, I'd have to say there was an attempt to breastfeed at the emergency evacuation stations. However, because of our intense need to be helpful and to make sure that the children were being fed, I'm 100% sure bottles were being shoved down their throats. And not always the right formula. So we do need to pay attention. We need to wrap the family in a secure cocoon when they show up on our doorstep in the evacuation centers, and support the mother with every single thing she needs. We also found out that it's often the mother that fills in the forms. And if it's a new Canadian, a new mother who speaks very little English, it's the older children that know how to translate for them. And if we separate the kids from the mother, she is isolated. And we learned so much building this infant child unit, and realized how everything at the evacuation center is centered on that baby. And that little cutie patootie became the primary state of concern for everybody at the center. And that everybody really needed to be trained, right from the retired volunteers that show up, that seem to always have time to volunteer. Wonderful. They need to be trained. Also, the men that showed up as allies and as volunteers at the reception centers needed to be trained. And everybody's nerves were fried, and everybody was on their 24th cup of coffee. And when you hear a baby cry and the babies are fussing, all you want to do is make sure they're fed, the diapers are changed. So we had a truckload, and I'm not even joking, probably several truckloads of diapers arrived, no big deal, had that covered. But when it came to feeding, we made a lot of mistakes. And those lessons were all incorporated into this fantastic baby child unit, which I understand is now being used in Australia. So I think I should go there, oddly, and really help them out.
I'll come with you.
But now in my role as the United Way, where we fund agencies, I really do see a huge need to incorporate this into what the services our agencies provide to new parents. And emergencies are going to happen, right? We hear about climate change all the time. Heck, where is winter? Right? Where the fire season has already been declared in Fort McMurray. You can imagine how everybody's feeling, and I think it's here as well. Okay, maybe not a flood this year, but certainly pestilence. Okay, I'm just kidding about that.
Oh, please don't. No kidding. I
Sharknado
don't want
for
to
sure.
attract any bad juju.
But things are going to happen, and are we preparing our mothers and our fathers for the absolute certainty that there will be something that happens during your infant's existence where you will need to leave your home in a hurry, or you will need to change from routine A to routine XYZ in the space of 3 days? So we do need to plan, we do need to educate, and that needs to be incorporated, it needs to be supported, and it needs to be well funded.
Absolutely. Leslie, I have a question for you when we're talking about breastfeeding in disasters, and we're talking about breastfeeding as a form of protection against infant food insecurity. One of the things that's very interesting is that the parents who are most impacted by food insecurity generally are also the parents who are least likely to meet their breastfeeding goals and breastfeeding recommendations. Can you tell us a little bit about what your research has told us about why that is?
You bet. I'm gonna come back to something you said too, if I remember. So, I would say my research has three main trajectories. One is how breastfeeding is used as a strategy for food security for women that are food insecure, right? So this thinking about breastfeeding as a food production system. And then I'd say the second one is the structural inequities that render breastfeeding a non-sustainable food system. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third one is the outcomes of food insecurities for families and babies consuming breast milk substitutes in a country that leaves food insecurity solutions to charity. So particularly within the context of first food systems shocks, and we heard about a couple of them, whether those be economic shocks, so I'd like to bring in the conversation of economic emergencies into this idea of emergencies with the current cost of living crisis, rising levels of household food insecurity, rising levels of childhood food insecurity, and the fact that our food insecurity measures don't capture the experiences of children under 2. We know though that children under 1 have the highest child poverty rates in Canada, and that's a little known fact, and I think it's really important to remember. And then more broad-based sort of first food system shocks. We heard about the infant formula shortage would be one example of that, food contamination at plants, commercial supply chain issues that began during COVID. If I want to just focus in on breastfeeding though, that's sort of that first, like what is the relationship between food insecurity and breastfeeding? We've done a number of projects that tease out that question. The first one was qualitative. It was based on interviews with mothers in Nova Scotia across the province, and I was really interested in finding out what does maternal and infant food insecurity look like. And it was mothers' stories that revealed this drive to breastfeed because of all the reasons people want to breastfeed, but with this extra layer of economics, the economic or food security that it would bring their baby when they didn't have enough money to feed it in any other way. And what we found was really high rates of breastfeeding initiation amongst food insecure mothers. They conceptualized breastfeeding as a resilient and perfect food system, but most, I would say, expressed the financial worries of saying, I knew there wasn't enough money, wasn't going to be able to afford infant formula, I needed to produce enough milk. So mothers were drawn to breastfeeding because of food insecurity and concerns of infant health, and some mothers were very successful in exclusive breastfeeding, but more often, despite the high initiation rates, they stopped early. So we then wanted to say, okay, is this just a thing in Nova Scotia? So taking a look at the Canadian Community Health Survey data across a number of cycles. We were able to look at the breastfeeding variables in relation to the food security module, and we're able to establish, looking at 10,000 or plus women's experiences in Canada, that in fact food insecurity does reduce the odds, or it sort of compared to food insecure women, they stop exclusive breastfeeding earlier. So only about 50% exclusively breastfed to 2 months, where 50% of women that were food insecure that began breastfeeding were exclusively feeding to 4 months, for example. So there's a fair difference. Now, we've also looked at it, like what the cost and affordability of growing and feeding a baby in Canada, and done some economic modeling of breastfeeding. The cost of breastfeeding, what is it if you live in a low income circumstance? And found, there's 18 different family scenarios, but I'll tell you just one. If you live on income assistance in Nova Scotia, and you have a family of 4 with a 3-month-old baby and a 4-year-old child, and if you purchased a basic nutritious diet, and even with a breastfed baby, you would be minus, this is based on 2015 data, negative $500 plus a month in the hole. We've also analyzed maternity benefit replacements. You're also in the hole. You're a little less in the hole. This is based on previous labor, like working for minimum wage, and now on maternity leave, if you're eligible for it. If the baby's formula fed, you're still in the hole. You're a little bit more in the hole, but depending on the type of infant formula, whether it be you could be $30 more in the hole, or $900 more in the hole, depending on the type of infant formula. And then I'll say my last piece of research that really looked at this, we just did a survey of about 1,500 Nova Scotian families with children under 2, where we tested a number of indicators of infant food insecurity across all the ways that they're fed, both in the social implications, and we found a food insecurity rate of over 30%, so 32%, if my memory serves me correctly. So that's families with babies in Nova Scotia that were like high rate of food insecurity. And the compromises that they were making, it compromised breastfeeding. People breastfed as long as possible to ensure that their child had access to food. They worried about their breast milk quality because of the fact that they weren't eating enough. They stopped breastfeeding early because they weren't eating enough. They worried about the cost of infant formula and not being able to buy it. They ran out of infant formula and didn't have the money to buy more. They stole infant formula from the store. They diluted infant formula to make it stretch. They skipped infant feeding times. They stayed with their families to help them feed their babies. They compromised their older children's food sources to make sure they could buy infant formula, and I can go on and on and on. But these are the things we tested.
Thank you. Yes, and that's very interesting. And actually, my next question is, oh, sorry.
Are you asking all the questions, or?
There's going to be a chance at the end.
Okay.
But if you, yeah. Sorry. Leslie, I wanted to, Jessica, I wanted to pull a lot of the components that Leslie was talking about in terms of the 5P program at Parkdale, which really addresses not the infant food security as a family problem, and maybe give us a little bit of detail about the research that you had on that program and its effectiveness. We'll try and tighten our comments up as much as we can so we have time for questions.
Yeah, I think, so 5Ps is one of the programs that we support, and we've actually expanded last year to supporting 2 other programs. So over the last 2 years, we've served over 450 families with infant feeding support. The research has showed us that families feel less stressed because of the support they're getting. They're feeling less anxious. They're feeling that they can make more informed decisions about, how to stretch your groceries, how to find your local food bank, how to just get the resources that you need to feed your family, and then also how to ask for support, how to advocate in the hospitals about what you want and the food choices that you're having. So I would say overall our programs just are kind of supporting that wrap around all of the social determinants of health of the families that impact their decisions around feeding, impact their access to the care that they want, and then addressing the mom's security as well, their food security, and then in turn addressing the infant's food security.
Thank you. And that wraparound piece, I think, is a theme you'll hear a lot. One of the really strong themes in the film is around the importance of birth in community, that the birth that closes the film is such a powerful moment. But also so many families in Canada don't get to birth in their communities and don't get to birth with their families, whether that's because of birth evacuations or lack of services in their particular community at a given time. And Heather, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that impacts infant feeding, both in the immediate moment and when families come home.
Sure, yeah, I can definitely do that. So when I moved to the Northwest Territories, I was one of two midwives who established a midwifery program in a community that didn't have birthing services at that time. So we effectively returned birthing to the community. And we still had quite a few clients who would elect to travel for birth. And what I saw with regards to infant feeding, and this is in the context of having midwifery care, you're making an informed decision to leave the community for birth. Likely you're gone for a shorter time than if there is no midwifery services in the community. You're coming back to midwives who are actually both lactation consultants and really good breastfeeding support. And we noticed that we see that families who are away, they experience higher levels of stress during the weeks leading up to their birth. They find that they feel the lack of continuity of care, so having to meet new people, not knowing who is actually going to be at your birth. Some people will have a family member or a friend who's able to actually go with them to the community to be support, but it's just one person. And often, it creates disconnect from the community, and there is not funding to bring other children that you might have with you. So there's a lot of challenges and stressors that happen there. We see that people who are forced to leave their community for birth or make an informed decision, but especially when you don't have access to birthing services in the community at all, have higher rates of intervention during labor. There's more cesarean sections, more episiotomies, more all kinds of different things. We see that, and we have data from the Northwest Territories that shows that. We also see that families are more likely to supplement in hospital. There's some people they're eager to get home, which makes sense, and the nurses and physicians at the hospital are eager to send people home with babies that are being fed. And so there is sometimes a trend to, yes, I want to breastfeed, but I'm going to supplement my baby so I can get home. And then once I'm home, I'm going to breastfeed. But interrupting breastfeeding during that early time has major consequences. And people are often going home to communities where they don't have access to really great breastfeeding support. We see that when you don't have birthing services in the community and people are being forced to leave, the healthcare providers who are working in those communities just aren't as comfortable and confident providing prenatal care, providing care during that postpartum period. People are nervous about birth in the community rather than excited, and that transmits through to the whole community. You're losing, especially in Indigenous communities, you're losing a lot of traditional knowledge, and this has been happening since the 60s. So we now have generations of people who haven't had the opportunity to learn those traditional practices that support breastfeeding. And it really shows in our exclusive breastfeeding rates. And there's some communities have really strong breastfeeding traditions, and those communities have long periods of exclusive breastfeeding. And then we have communities where they haven't maintained those traditional practices as well, and they have much lower rates of breastfeeding. So that's something that we see, like just clinical impacts, there's social impacts. Communities are forced to not be welcoming their babies within their communities, and there's still people who are dying in the communities, right? And traditionally, birth and death, it's like a cycle, and when you only have one end of that cycle happening in your community, it has major impacts throughout the entire fabric of the community. So yeah, birth evacuations lead to reduced breastfeeding and a whole lot of other problems.
That's a very powerful idea of both ends of life, right? Those two transitions that get, one of which gets seen. Steph, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about, we've talked lots over the years about the importance of having traditional indigenous lactation knowledge and infant feeding knowledge in communities, but also with your work with internationally with ILCA and with the WHO and UNICEF around those traditional practices in other cultures getting run over, which you see in the film. So the traditional practice and how we can do better at really focusing our attention on the culturally appropriate, culturally meaningful supports.
Thank you. There's a document that came out a few years ago. It's in the Safelyfed Code Congress that the letter at the end, which I wrote. So there's this paper that proves that during the 1940s and 50s, after World War II, government officials came to our reserves here and said, here's the formula, you feed every 4 hours, you're gonna do it or you're gonna lose funding. I mean, it happened in Canada, and it would happen at every other colonized nation around the world. I mean, I'm a member of the NCIM too, and we talk about an Indigenous midwife in every community, but we need Indigenous lactation in every community. As Kathy said, breastfeeding, chest feeding absolutely does help overcome intergenerational trauma. I have worked with some of my own clients where they were in a bad place mentally. But once they realized the power of skin to skin and all those oxytocin rushes, and the baby loves them, then they feel lovable. And once they feel lovable, they have more, not just self-esteem, but a lot more power in themselves as the main parent. Now, around the world, I mean, I think anybody here who studied the WHO code knows exactly why everything started. Because anti-indigenous, anti-black racism is still a thing. And I get really emotional. We had a client the other day whose baby needed to get Billy checked. And I had to talk to her for 5 minutes about what to say, how to say it, and just said, you do what you need to get out, and I'm gonna fix the breastfeeding once you get here. It's 2024, we shouldn't have to be doing this anymore. And the fact that they will just say, the hospitals will say supplement, if baby's blood sugar is low, instead of breastfeeding and skin to skin, it's atrocious. It takes, I mean, I've had clients told by nurses, you know, your milk's not in it, you're failing your baby, so you better put the baby on formula, or I'm going to apprehend your baby. And that, again, it's not just Canada, it happens in Australia. It happens every colonized nation around the world. So what we need to do, we don't need more white people telling us what to do, to be honest. Like, there's 11 Indigenous lactation consultants in Canada. A lot of reserves have lactation consultants working there. They are non-Indigenous. I've done a lot of teaching, haven't made it to the east, mind you.
I think you might have some invites.
The knowledge is there. But when it's been 3 or 4 generations of being told how to parent or else, and we're still being told that in hospitals, it's gotta stop. We need money to train indigenous lactation consultants. And I'm just gonna end right there.
Perfect, I agree. I think, Lori, I just wanted to ask, I know we're cutting a little long, so we'll try and I wanna make sure that we have an opportunity to answer questions. But I did wanna ask you about, from the perspective of someone who's looked at this over a long period of time, from chronic disease as well as a regulatory and a policy perspective, what is it that you think that the healthcare system needs from policy to make it do, because we know what the interventions are, we know what we need to do, and yet we still seem to consistently fail, and for a variety of reasons, but the failure and the difficulty in really achieving those goals continues. What do you think that would push us over into more action? And then Rafael, I'm gonna ask you that question too, because I'm
I'm gonna think about that for a second. But I guess what I would say is, I mean, you know, the culture of, I guess, you know, the umbrella of women's health and then infant health in Canada, unfortunately, and we probably hate to say it as Canadians, is just not great. You know, we've all said, you know, most of the average rates of initiation in our country are 9 out of 10 women. So everybody's here to support informed choice, whatever that choice is, but the reality is most women actually want to breastfeed, and these surveys have been done in all provinces right across the country numerous times. But by the time they leave hospital, you're probably at 60%. And by the time 6 months comes, it might be 30% in Canada, and our province is 12%. I mean, the regional variations are just dramatic. So 1 in 10 children are being exclusively breastfed in a country where we actually should have resources and support, but we actually don't. So I think from a healthcare system perspective, and again, you get to a point where you kind of are doing research and you start to think, okay, what's going to make the difference? I mean, there's definitely a lack of training of healthcare professionals, and I'm specifically referring to physicians and nurses here at the moment. Well, lack of, I think, implementation of midwifery versus training, and the same with lactation consultants. I think the training's there, but actually
Midwives don't get any, most midwives in Canada have no lactation training.
okay, because we're kind of just implementing midwifery in Newfoundland, and we've seen a vast difference in the hospitals where midwifery is actually being implemented versus others. So I think, despite training, they're obviously supportive. So I think that's probably a good thing. But in terms of expansion of midwifery across the country, I mean, that's something I think a lot of provinces are actually challenged with. Increasing the number of lactation consultants, I think we have maybe less than 15 or 12 in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're dealing with a lot of your indigenous issues as well in Labrador as well. I mean, working towards baby-friendly hospital initiative designation. And for those that don't know, it's a designation of hospitals that are actually adhering to 10 steps of successful breastfeeding. And it relates to all sorts of things, from antenatal education to what happens to a baby or a birthing mother in terms of skin to skin in the first hour of life, to the promotion of breastfeeding before a mother leaves hospital, formula being only given if it's indicated, almost medically, right through to community services. So without that sort of warm chain, we call it, to a certain extent, that holistic approach with all healthcare professionals working collaboratively, I think it's going to be a challenge. I think we've somehow got to make it a priority, and the health benefits, the economic benefits we've already referred to are enormous. If we could only just focus on breastfeeding and increasing the breastfeeding rates in this Canada, we would actually solve a number of other problems.
Thank you. Rafael, I will say, I'll ask this in English. Okay, so I think the last question before we wrap up and ask questions from the floor is, MAC has been working on the code and the protection of breastfeeding for decades, but has recently really refocused their energy around the code. And I wanted to ask, because you're really, as an organization, the amount of work and the amount of advocacy and the effectiveness of your advocacy has been very strong. And I would like to know what it is that you're hoping to achieve with that advocacy refocus while you continue to work on all these different files.
La question en français, est-ce qu'il y a un mot que vous n'avez pas compris? Juste la question.
Alors la question c'est, vous avez révisé votre focus sur le code en travaillant encore sur tous les différents sujets. Et qu'est-ce que vous voulez, qu'est-ce qui a été la force derrière cette décision et qu'est-ce que vous voulez achever au court terme sur le code?
Au niveau du code de l'OMS, ce qu'on se rend compte, c'est que si on fait juste faire de la promotion de l'allaitement et qu'on ne protège pas l'allaitement et qu'on ne protège pas les femmes qui allaitent et qu'on ne les soutient pas, on met toute la pression sur les femmes. On leur dit, il faut allaiter et débrouille-toi pour le faire, je ne veux pas savoir ce que tu fais. Et ça, c'est absolument inadmissible au niveau de société. C'est vraiment une responsabilité collective. Et ce qu'on se rend compte aussi, c'est que tous les efforts qu'on va faire pour promouvoir, pour soutenir l'allaitement, si on ne met pas en œuvre le code, tout le marketing de ces produits-là vient vraiment fragiliser tous les efforts qu'on fait à ce niveau-là. Est-ce que tu veux traduire un peu pour le monsieur?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and translate it. So what Rafael is explaining is that so much of our focus is on the individual woman's actions and the individual woman's decisions, when in fact so much of the responsibility, so much of the work is actually collective work, and we have a collective responsibility to women and to their children to protect them. And when we don't interrupt the commercial influences, that we make more fragile that choice environment for families, and we certainly make more fragile their food security environment.
Quand on étudie un petit peu les violations du code au niveau du Canada, il y a deux stratégies qui ressortent beaucoup. La première, c'est de se rendre sympathique aux yeux et leurs produits aux yeux des professionnels de la santé. Il y a beaucoup d'approches pour convaincre les professionnels de la santé que leurs produits sont bons, ils sont utiles, ils servent à plein de choses. Et ça explique en partie pourquoi on a autant de problèmes avec la formation des professionnels de la santé à la base, parce que c'est vraiment contaminé, y compris par des centres de la malnutrition infantile, par exemple, où c'est de la recherche qui est faite par des gens qui veulent remplacer l'allaitement et pas régler les problèmes de l'allaitement. Beaucoup d'argent qui est fait à ce niveau-là. La deuxième chose qu'on voit, c'est beaucoup sur les réseaux sociaux de messages qui viennent mettre en doute les femmes à leur capacité d'allaiter. C'est-à-dire que c'est tous des petits messages qui sont instillés, puis de revendiquer ceci, cela. On peut voir des messages aussi alarmants que les temps de fête de fin d'année, c'est un temps où vous allez être plus fatigué, ça peut être un bon moment pour vous d'introduire un biberon. Ou bienvenue au club de 3h du matin, si vous n'arrivez pas à vous rendormir après avoir allaité votre enfant, pas donner un biberon, allaiter votre enfant, venez rejoindre notre club. Puis c'est un baby club qui est fait par des fabricants de biberons. Et donc il faut vraiment adresser ce problème-là, sinon c'est comme si on ouvrait un grand robinet, mais si on ferme pas, si on n'empêche pas les fuites par ailleurs, on fera juste faire circuler de l'eau, il n'y a rien qui va changer.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, so I took notes this time. So I think what Rafael said, that there are really two strategies that are particularly affected by the baby food industry here in Canada, and the first one is the focus on becoming tied to and friendly with and of service to healthcare providers and their organizations. And when we talk about the difficulties in training and the difficulties in getting those messages that we know work, that we know these interventions work, into actual practice, one of the difficulties with that is that so much of the education and the training is happening as either paid for or influenced by industry. And the second major factor in the Canadian market is around the social media, the emotive messaging. So the use of emotion and very personal social media contacts that sow self-doubt in women's trust in their own bodies, whether that's in the milk that their bodies make, or whether it's in their own capacity to actually cope with parenting these young children. And the example that she used is the 3 a.m. club. So the 3 a.m. club from the formula company is sort of a little ad, and it says, after you've breastfed your baby, here, and you're so tired, here, come to our community where you will find support, and also plenty of coupons and marketing to stop being breastfeeding at 3 in the morning and instead being making a bottle at 3 in the morning. No one ever points that part out. So I thank you everyone for all of your comments. I appreciate that we're going a little bit over on the time. I did want to give an opportunity to Noemi to.
No, I'll leave it
Oh,
for the
you'll
end.
close
That's
it.
fine.
Okay, perfect. So, do we have any questions? No, they all came back.
Hi there, Carol Hughes, MP for Algoma, Manitoba, Kapuskasing. Certainly, I want to say, Stephanie? Okay. Stephanie, I just want to thank you for your input today, especially. I want to thank everybody for their input. But on the Indigenous front, we know that it's the fastest growing demographic in Canada. I really appreciate the fact that you indicated that there needs to be funding for programs. And I think when we're looking at young people, you know, the importance there of really sending out those teachings and the training that needs to be put in place in the communities to make sure that we encourage young women to breastfeed. I know that a lot of the communities, not in my riding, but my riding actually host evacuees from Kisheshuan and from Attawapiskat. And so I'm just not sure, but you've made it my mission now to go and find out when they come to the community that houses them, or that hosts them, should I say, as to whether or not there is an incentive there that they're trying to get people to give them this this formula, as opposed to, you know, seeing what they need, you know, for their breastfeeding. Just their breastfeeding efforts, you know, like better food and stuff like that. So I'm just trying to get some sense as to what you see, or if you have a percentage of how many people in the First Nations are actually reverting to bottle feeding as opposed to breastfeeding, given the fact that the generational trauma is there, and that we have such a younger generation, right? So is it picking up, or is it still stagnant when it comes to breastfeeding? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah. I think it kind of depends on where the birth is located. Like Heather said, if it's a home birth, if it's a home community birth, the rates are usually much higher because we don't have the commercial influence of formula companies in the hospital. And we don't have, I used to precept midwifery students from McMaster in their 2-week rounds, and they didn't get any information about breastfeeding much except for on the floor of the hospital. So what we need money to go to individual communities and find out what their teachings are. And we need an Indigenous lactation consultant to facilitate all that, because that knowledge has to stay within the community. When I teach at MAC, one of the big things that I push is that there's not a cookie cutter solution. Like, I come from a matriarchal society, and Anishinaabe is patriarchal. Anishinaabe have a medicine wheel, we don't. So trying to have a one-step solution to hand out to people sometimes doesn't work. Although I have seen flyers and brochures that do a fantastic job, they're just really far and in between to find. So getting a conference going of Indigenous birth workers and lactation consultants, I think, is a great place to start. I know in my reserve, like our public health unit, they've never had a lactation consultant. I work out of the birthing center, so we need to find people who are doing the work. I was at Norway House, Manitoba, with the breastfeeding sales cap on, actually, and the teachings that I heard from some of the people are so colonized and fear-based. Like, they're so good in the language, and then one of the women in the training said, "Oh, we tell our moms not to have pickles because it's going to sour their milk," and it just isn't a thing. So we need.
What about broccoli?
I think stuff too. It's really important not to think about Indigenous communities as like this monolithic category, because it's not, and that's part of the problem, is that we check that box, and that's then we're done, right? And that's absolutely the opposite of what needs to happen.
Yeah.
We have one more question and then we'll wrap up.
This brought up a couple times, but specifically to you, Lori, in terms of the education of our healthcare community with the nurses in hospitals. I know, like, I was involved with a pediatrician at CHIO to try to develop curriculum for the physicians, for pediatric residents and family physician residents on breastfeeding, because they're not getting any education. There's also no system to make sure that even if there is a curriculum in place, that everybody will be exposed to it. And one of the things in leading up to creation of the curriculum was they did a survey of pediatric residents about their confidence in giving breastfeeding advice and then their accuracy in giving breastfeeding advice. And they were like 90% confident in giving like 10% accurate information. So that's obviously a big issue, and I work with, you know, that cohort of breastfeeding moms on a regular basis. I just had a person come in this week who's no longer breastfeeding because of bad advice from her physician, wrong advice from her physician. What can we do when there isn't really a standardized educational system to capture, like, not every resident gets exposed to the same things, it's just whatever you happen to be exposed to on the floor. So how do we fix that aspect of things when there's not really a standard?
I mean, I guess that's the biggest challenge, I suppose, because, I mean, you see it with family doctors as well, obviously. And I mean, I can just speak from transparency. I have a daughter who's a family physician who's just finished her training. And for somebody who's been doing research for over 20 years, I'm just kind of dismayed at just how little training they did get. I mean, one lecture, no hands-on. I mean, they really do not have enough. They might be giving bad advice, but they don't have any advice to give. So I mean, I suppose from a curriculum perspective, you're really talking about lobbying, you know, some of the bodies that actually dictate what are the priorities when it comes to physicians, but nurses as well. I mean, nurses are actually around, you know, to a certain extent, the babies more than the physicians would be, but their training has been reduced as well. So I mean, I think you've got a lot of competing interests going on in the curriculum of healthcare professionals, which is difficult. We've now got a limited number of healthcare professionals in the country when it comes to general practitioners. I think just even this week they said, you know, 1 in 10 people don't have a family doctor right across the country. So who are people going to? They're going to the internet, right? They're going to potentially peers. But in terms of some of those bodies and priorities, I mean, that's a tricky, challenging area. I mean, most of us here do this work because we're passionate about it. We're usually fighting against the sort of limited resources. When it comes to the education piece, there's education out there, there's evidence, we actually know what we need to do for the most part, but what we need is a collective holistic approach, which takes pressure off some healthcare professionals with the ability to speak to lactation consultants, midwives, for example, community peer support. I mean, there's lots of models that have been shown to be effective, which don't necessarily rely on a healthcare professional, but the reality is the hospital, leading up to hospital is critical. Once you get out into the community, you know, a lot of it is just frequency of contact. We just published a systematic review and meta-analysis which looked at what sort of virtual interventions kind of post leaving hospital effective in increasing exclusive breastfeeding rates, and it was shown that they were. It kind of came out of the COVID pandemic when everything went virtual. But the reality was it was just constant sort of frequency of contact, checking in with the mother, being able to answer those questions, relieve some of the worries and you know, anxiety around either lack of milk or problems that will come up. But you also need the specialist support when things do go wrong, whether it's mastitis or issues with nipples and infections. I mean, there's a host of things that need to be dealt with in the health system. So I can't say I've got an answer to it, but I think you've highlighted that there's a huge challenge there as well.
Did we have one more question? Laila, did you want to?
Sure. Thank you guys again for all of your work on this. I think it brought up many different aspects that are complicated and yet not so complicated. I was wondering if you guys could possibly touch on if you've heard some of the same that I've heard. So I've had some friends and constituents that reach out that are very much being encouraged through the public health to choose formula rather than breastfeed, specifically because of the NIHB. and saying like, oh, well, you can get this for free. So like, why wouldn't you? Because you can get this for free. And then in the particular communities I hear it from, then the Métis families that do not qualify for that feel like they have less than, and that they are failing because they have to breastfeed, and it's almost like bottle feeding is a status symbol. And so I'm just wondering if either, ideally both of the Indigenous people on our panel could possibly touch on that and see if that's something a little bit larger than just northeastern Alberta's.
Oh, this is something I think about a lot, because I so deeply support people to make the decisions that they need to make that are right for them. But I think this comes back to what do people know about breast or chest feeding and lactation, and it's one of the problems when we make the point, well, it's going to save you money as one of the reasons to breastfeed, because that's like a very practical thing. It's an important thing to understand what's the cost, but and this comes down to sometimes as well, like in Indigenous communities, the fracturing of that birth, the birthing knowledge and the traditional knowledge about pregnancy and parenting, and the traditional teachings that we all have around breastfeeding and around human milk, and like the magical, powerful substance it is. Breastfeeding is the first act of love that we can do for our babies, and there is no way to replicate human milk. And I think as well, like just like having people who understand some of the other issues that Indigenous communities are facing, like chronic disease and RSV season, holy smokes, this year, and like all kinds of other things, gastroenteritis, so diarrhea, and like there is actually research that shows that in Canada, breastfeeding saves Indigenous babies' lives, and because we don't have Indigenous midwives, we do have some, I want to make that clear, but we don't but because we don't have Indigenous midwives in every community, because we don't have Indigenous lactation consultants, because we don't have elders like sharing their teachings, like there's just so many things that are happening in Indigenous communities that are stopping that knowledge from being transmitted properly, and you have people sharing these inaccurate messages. And so I think that like the answer to that problem comes down to supporting the growth of Indigenous midwifery, Indigenous lactation consultants, Indigenous like self-determination when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and parenting, and nothing other than Indigenous communities determining the solutions for themselves is going to work.
I have just a quick thing. So I've been to many lactation conferences, and I love research. But they'll talk about the primitive reflexes that a baby has to crawl to the nurse, to crawl up to nurse. And when we say it so clinically, it's offensive to us. Because what we're taught and what we teach our moms is that, you know, the last part of your pregnancy, Creator's teaching your baby what to do. Creator's teaching your baby how to crawl to the breast and to nurse without help. So even if you're not doing anything, the baby's gonna make it. And then putting that to, if you're having latching issues, if you nurse baby when they're mostly asleep, it's knowledge from the Creator. It's not memory of their last latch. So making it a more, I don't even know what the term would be, not humane, but a more beautiful.
More human.
Yeah,
more human.
Yeah, it's not a clinical, I mean, it can be clinical. I mean, I read research, it can be very clinical. But if we lose that heart, I mean, I work with a lot of formula feeding parents too, and I still teach them about that skin to skin. Because if it wasn't meant to be done, there wouldn't be so many benefits to skin to skin contact.
Yeah, and I think too that we've talked about like many of the interventions. Many of the interventions are agnostic to feeding methods. So the things that we're doing to support parents to be with their children and to be in connection with their children is not tied to whether or not they're breastfeeding or not. We do too much of that connecting instead of really focusing on the relationship between those two people. And I think too, pulling back, so we'll wrap up now and we'll have a chance to chat some more as we eat. But I do think that it's really key that when we talk about, you know, the gaps and the holes and the difficulty in getting that curriculum up and the difficulty in connecting all of these different pieces. And the word wraparound has come up in so many of the comments here today. And that wraparound from the perspective of government power, from state power, is really about having policies that wrap around all of these things. So they wrap around the hospitals, they wrap around the healthcare workers, they wrap around the regulations, they wrap around the services that we provide, so that we're not doing things like designing infant food security programs that reduce infant food security because they incentivize using infant formula over not using infant formula, right? Like your public health program should not create an incentive for that like not recommended product to be used. At the same time, we need to make sure that babies have access to the food that they need. So we really need sophisticated ways of looking at this, and that starts with having an infant feeding policy that really provides an overarching umbrella so that we make the right decision, so that we're not creating programs that are excluding parents who need help. We're also not creating programs that incentivize behaviors that have poor health outcomes for the population. So we have all of this information, we have it all, but we don't have good policy that really drives and connects these pieces together. So I encourage you to chat with our panelists about their various areas of expertise. It is quite an unusual thing to have so many of them in the room, and so much expertise. I'm so grateful to each of you for having taken time out of your very busy schedules and flown clear across the country in many cases, or driven in some cases, and stuff too. So thank you all for coming and for sharing this afternoon with us. I'm going to let Noemi close the afternoon because, of course, she's the one who brought us all here.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't have enough words to talk about the expertise of the panel and putting clearly coast to coast expertise here. Thank you. Before we close and before I thank the two majors, Safelyfed Canada, for having created this as well, to the comment of indigenous communities, in my experience as a storyteller, I tell stories, so I'm just the ambassador of other people's comments. I retell what they tell me, but we have done in 2018 a very, very large outreach with the milk educational program into indigenous communities. You must remember that we were together in a number of screenings as well. One of the things that stuck with me for a very long time till today, and it brings me to tears again, was opening up to the discussion after watching the film and seeing the whole community that was together gathering watching the film telling me what we just saw, that you showed us in the film from third world countries, is what we are experiencing in our communities. Not only on the fact that we have all the gifts that come in from the formula companies, but as well, we don't have clean water. We don't have the training to tell the parents how to sterilize that bottle because they feel that under the stress that they are going through, they don't have the means to breastfeed that baby, and it's better to give them formula. So it was so shocking for me to see everybody crying in the way that they were, and because they really felt that whatever was on screen was representative of themselves, which was my intention to begin with. All of the things that we have seen in the film are symbols of hundreds of other stories, for not saying more than almost thousands that I have seen around the world. So the fact of being here, people ask me what I do and I tell them I produce dreams. This is a dream, to be able to address to all of you, to have your support, to have the possibility that if you have the chance to make a difference in your community, if you have the means to talk to government, it is the cheapest way that we can do to actually protect our families and protect our babies. it's the future that we are doing. And as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, I can only do the advocacy work by bringing the stories from the protagonists themselves. To Michelle and Jodine, I have no words to thank you for putting all of this together. To our hosting MPs, thank you so much. To the ones who have been here with us today, thank you for joining us. And please continue to follow our work. We have one more virtual screening coming up. Everybody's inviting, it's free. Invite everybody in your community because we need to continue educating people so they make an informed decision, whatever it is. We are not here to judge. So thank you. Please join us for some food and drinks, and we'll continue our conversation. Thanks so much, everybody.